It all began the moment my family and I moved into what we thought was going to be our peaceful forever home. A quiet brick house sitting at the edge of a suburban neighborhood where the lawns were green, the sidewalks were freshly paved, and the streets looked like something out of a real estate magazine. But behind that carefully painted picture of suburban bliss lurked the self appointed queen of the block, Karen, the woman who insisted on running the Homeowners Association as if it were her personal empire, though in reality, our street technically wasn't even part of the HOA boundaries. And that was the very heart of the storm that was about to unfold in ways none of us could have predicted. When we first toured the home, the realtor offhandedly mentioned that the property was exempt from HOA dues because the developer had never annexed the lot into the neighborhood association, which at the time felt like nothing more than a financial blessing, saving us hundreds of dollars a year on arbitrary fees. But little did we know that decision years earlier had painted a glowing target on our backs the moment we arrived with our moving truck, because Karen, with her clipboard, her sunglasses perched like a crown, and her permanent scowl, marched right up to us before the first box was even carried inside and announced in a voice laced with fake cheeriness that all residents on this street are expected to maintain compliance with HOA regulations and dues. And when I politely corrected her by explaining that our property record showed we were outside the jurisdiction, her expression hardened into that of someone who had been publicly challenged in her own castle, something she clearly couldn't stomach. In that instant, I could see the wheels of retaliation turning behind her eyes, the calculating glint that warned me she wasn't going to let this go. And although I brushed it off at first, eager to focus on unpacking and settling my family, I soon realized that ignoring Karen was impossible because she made it her daily mission to remind us that we were, in her mind, squatters defying her rule, constantly dropping off notices, demanding lawn inspections, and even trying to photograph our backyard from the sidewalk under the pretense of community standards enforcement, which might have been laughable if it wasn't so invasive, and my wife began growing increasingly uneasy, especially after our children told us that Karen had cornered them while they played basketball in the driveway, asking if they knew that their parents were cheating the neighborhood by not paying dues, a move that crossed from petty annoyance to personal harassment in my book. Yet each time I confronted her, she maintained this smug air of righteousness, as though she were convinced the law itself bent to her authority. Weeks passed like this, each day escalating in some small way, until the inevitable clash finally came one bright Saturday morning when Karen, accompanied by two members of her HOA board, equally stiff clipboard-carrying accomplices, approached our porch and delivered what she dramatically called a final demand, a typed letter claiming that failure to join the HOA and pay 3 years of back dues, which was absurd since we had just moved in, would result in legal action, liens, and police involvement. And though I tried to keep calm, I laughed outright at the mention of cops, asking her if she seriously thought law enforcement had time to arrest someone for refusing to pay fees to a private association that had no legal authority over us. Her cheeks flushed crimson at my laughter, and I could tell she saw it as open rebellion, which to someone like her was worse than any fine. Defiance meant her power was being mocked, and in her world that was intolerable. So after a dramatic huff and a promise that I would regret this insolence, she stomped off with her entourage, muttering loudly enough for the neighbors to hear that the freeloaders would be dealt with properly. And though I shook my head at the theatrics, a small part of me knew this wasn't the end, because people like Karen didn't let things go. They escalated, and escalate she did, faster than even I expected. It was around noon that same day when a police cruiser rolled up in front of our house, two officers stepping out with a mix of confusion and irritation already painted across their faces, and after introducing themselves, they explained that they had received a call from the HOA president claiming that unauthorized residents were refusing to comply with neighborhood ordinances, which sounded ridiculous enough that even the officers smirked as they said it. And when I showed them the deed, the tax records, and even the realtor's note confirming we were exempt from the HOA, they nodded, apologized for the inconvenience, and said they'd let their sergeant know it was a civil matter outside their scope, but the humiliation wasn't on me. It was on Karen, who stood a few yards away, arms crossed and lips pursed as she watched the cop shake my hand and drive off without so much as a warning, a public defeat that clearly burned her pride like acid. Yet instead of retreating, she doubled down, pulling out her phone, furiously typing as though she was rallying her army, and within an hour a convoy of cars began arriving at the HOA's clubhouse down the street, board members filing inside with folders and laptops looking every bit like generals preparing for war. And though I had no idea at the time their so-called emergency board meeting was about to set into motion the very events that would lead to their spectacular downfall later that afternoon, because while Karen was busy plotting how to crush me, she had no idea that several of her board's questionable financial activities had already been flagged by local authorities, and her attempt to sic the cops on me was the last straw that put their operation under a magnifying glass. By mid-afternoon, as I was grilling burgers in the backyard and trying to salvage a normal day with my family, multiple unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into the neighborhood. Men and women in plain clothes stepping out with badges on their belts, walking directly toward the HOA clubhouse. And though I didn't know it then, those were investigators executing a search warrant that had been brewing for months, tipped off by resident complaints and suspicious bank records. But fate had aligned the timing so that only 3 hours after Karen called the cops on us for refusing to join her fiefdom, her entire board was being raided, files confiscated, computers bagged, and members escorted out under the watchful eyes of stunned neighbors who gathered on sidewalks whispering in disbelief. It was a sight so surreal that when word reached me, I could barely contain my laughter, not just because of the poetic justice, but because Karen herself, the woman who had spent weeks tormenting my family, was seen standing outside the clubhouse frantically arguing with investigators, her voice cracking as she demanded to know under whose authority they were operating, only to be met with the simple flash of a badge and the order to step aside. And in that instant, everything about her demeanor shifted from arrogant queen to cornered liar, the entire neighborhood watching as her empire crumbled in broad daylight. And though this was only the beginning of a much larger story, it was the moment I realized that sometimes the best revenge is patience, because people like Karen always dig their own graves. All you have to do is let them. The raid on the HOA clubhouse rippled through the neighborhood like a thunderclap, the kind of event people whispered about in hushed tones as though speaking too loudly might somehow drag them into the chaos. And though my family and I were technically outsiders to the HOA, we suddenly found ourselves at the epicenter of the unfolding scandal because neighbors who once eyed us with suspicion, brainwashed by Karen's propaganda about us being freeloaders, now began approaching with cautious curiosity, eager to know what I had said or done that might have triggered such a spectacular downfall. And while I tried to explain that I had absolutely nothing to do with the investigators showing up, many refused to believe it, convinced that I had somehow tipped off the authorities or held some secret leverage that had brought Karen's kingdom crumbling down. And though I repeatedly denied any involvement, I could feel the subtle shift in dynamics around us. Whispers turned into nods of respect, guarded stares softened into tentative waves, and within a matter of hours the same neighbors who had sided with Karen's demand for dues were treating us as if we had performed a public service, dismantling the petty tyranny that had plagued them for years. But behind all that attention, my own focus remained fixed on the surreal image of Karen standing powerless as officials carted away binders, laptops, and cardboard boxes full of records, her face pale and twitching with rage, because for the first time, she was not the one dictating the rules, she was the one being dictated to, and the irony of it wasn't lost on anyone. When the investigators left, the clubhouse looked like a gutted shell, its windows filled with gawking eyes, and within an hour the gossip machine was in overdrive. Stories poured out about how Karen and her board had allegedly been siphoning dues for community beautification, projects that never materialized, how landscaping contracts were mysteriously awarded to companies owned by relatives, and how late fees collected from residents seemed to disappear without explanation, all of which painted a picture of corruption so bold that even those who once admired Karen's strict standards began to see her for what she really was. And while my wife and I tried to stay on the sidelines, enjoying the schadenfreude quietly, Karen herself couldn't let us remain neutral, because in her mind, everything still somehow came back to us, her. Downfall wasn't her fault, it was ours, and by that evening she was already on the warpath, storming down the sidewalk in her usual aggressive stride, pointing a finger at our porch and shrieking that we had orchestrated the entire raid, that my wife and I were informants who had poisoned the board's good name, and she screamed it loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear, her voice cracking with desperation. And though I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, my kids were on the porch, their eyes wide with fear. So instead of engaging in her theatrics, I calmly told her to leave our property before I filed a harassment complaint, which only made her more hysterical, ranting about how she still had friends in high places and how she would make sure we paid for this betrayal before finally storming off into the night like a villain retreating to plot the next attack. But that encounter was only the beginning of a darker campaign, because if Karen couldn't control the HOA anymore, she would focus all of her energy on making our lives miserable, and she wasted no time. The very next morning, we woke up to find anonymous flyers stuffed into mailboxes and taped to lampposts, all of them smearing my family with outrageous lies, claims that we had falsified property records, that we were squatters exploiting a legal loophole, even that we were dangerous criminals hiding from the law, complete with a badly photoshopped image of my wife in an orange jumpsuit that was clearly ripped from some random mugshot online. And while most neighbors rolled their eyes at the ridiculousness, a handful still believed Karen's nonsense, or at least pretended to, if only to stay in her good graces, and that created a new layer of tension in the community. Invisible lines drawn between those who saw through her desperation and those who clung to her authority like loyal subjects, and living in the middle of that rift wasn't easy, especially for our kids, who began noticing. Classmates repeating things their parents had heard, asking if it was true that we didn't really belong in the neighborhood, and seeing their confusion and sadness lit a fire in me, a determination not just to defend my family's name, but to ensure that Karen's smear campaign backfired on her completely. What Karen didn't realize was that while she was busy trying to drag us down, the authorities were far from finished with her board. Within days, subpoenas were issued, bank accounts frozen, and whispers spread that criminal charges might follow. And yet, Karen walked around the neighborhood with the same forced confidence as always, stopping people on their lawns to insist that it was all a witch hunt orchestrated by outsiders, meaning us, and that she would be vindicated soon. But the cracks were obvious. The once loyal board members avoided her calls, the clubhouse was locked and abandoned, and residents who had paid thousands in dues were now demanding answers, some even threatening lawsuits of their own. And still Karen clung to the illusion of power, showing up uninvited to block parties, yelling at teenagers for unsanctioned basketball hoops, and pretending as though nothing had changed, which made her less of a leader and more of a neighborhood spectacle, a walking punchline that people tolerated only because they feared her temper. As the weeks rolled on, however, her obsession with us only deepened, and it escalated from flyers and verbal confrontations to something more sinister. Late at night, we began hearing the crunch of footsteps on gravel near our windows, the faint flash of a phone camera, and once even the sound of someone rattling our gate. And while we couldn't prove it was Karen, the timing and her unhinged demeanor made it obvious, so I installed cameras around the property, motion-activated lights, and even a security system that sent alerts straight to my phone, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the best way to deal with someone like her was with undeniable evidence. And sure enough, within a week, one of the cameras caught her crouched by our trash cans at 2 a.m., rummaging through bags as if searching for something incriminating she could use against us. And when I showed the footage to a couple of neighbors the next day, the collective gasp and head shaking confirmed what I already knew. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was unraveling before everyone's eyes, and the more she lashed out, the more isolated she became. Yet even then, part of me worried, because a cornered enemy can be dangerous, and Karen was nothing if not stubbornly relentless. Sure enough, the breaking point came one evening when she tried one final dramatic stunt, marching onto our lawn with a rolled-up document in hand, shouting that she had filed a civil lawsuit against us for damages to the HOA's reputation, waving papers that turned out to be nothing more than printouts of some bogus online legal form. And when I calmly told her that filing fraudulent court papers was a crime, she froze for the briefest second, realizing she'd overplayed her hand, before snapping back with her usual bluster and storming off again. But What she didn't know was that one of the neighbors had filmed the entire exchange from their porch, posting it on a local community page where it quickly went viral, sparking a flood of comments mocking Karen's antics and praising my family for our patience, and that viral moment cemented her fall from grace more than any raid or investigation could have, because it stripped her of the illusion of control she had clung to so tightly. After that, the whispers turned to open ridicule, neighbors laughing behind her back, kids mocking her walk, and even those who once feared her began ignoring her rants outright. And though that should have been the end of it, Karen still had one last card to play, one final scheme that would drag the entire neighborhood into chaos again. And little did we know, that scheme was already in motion, quietly behind the scenes, where Karen was pulling strings and making calls, determined to prove that she could still bend the law to her will, even if it destroyed everything around her in the process. Karen's last card, as it turned out, was not subtle, nor was it clever, but it was dangerous precisely because it was reckless, a desperate attempt to reassert dominance by dragging as many people down with her as possible. And it began with whispers of her reaching out to contacts beyond the neighborhood, individuals she boasted were influential friends who could set things right, though in truth these were little more than old acquaintances and distant relatives who owed her favors, or shared her taste for control. Yet she clung to them as though they were her private cavalry, telling anyone who would listen that she was assembling a task force to root out corruption, and while most rolled their eyes, her persistence bore fruit in a troubling way. Within 2 weeks, several residents reported receiving official-looking letters stamped with HOA insignia, letters demanding immediate payment of back dues into a new account, pending review, letters which bore Karen's signature at the bottom, but which clearly had not been sanctioned by any legitimate authority since the HOA had effectively been dissolved after the raid. And while many ignored the letters, a few, frightened of potential liens or penalties, actually paid, sending hundreds of dollars into a slush fund that Karen was operating out of a personal P.O. box. And this alone might have gone unnoticed for a while, if not for the fact that one elderly resident, confused and scared, went to the sheriff's office to confirm the validity of the demand. And that inquiry triggered a new round of official scrutiny, with investigators quickly linking the fraudulent letters to Karen's activities, which meant that once again, she had dug her own hole deeper. And yet, in her warped mind, she believed the increased attention was evidence of a conspiracy against her, further convincing her that my family was orchestrating everything, so she escalated once more, this time by targeting us directly with legal harassment, filing repeated frivolous complaints with code enforcement, zoning offices, and even animal control, each one claiming we were violating some obscure ordinance. And while none of them held water, the sheer volume of filings became a nuisance, forcing me to spend hours gathering documents, meeting inspectors, and proving compliance, which was clearly her goal, to exhaust us into submission, to make us regret ever defying her. But what she hadn't counted on was the growing tide of neighbors who were now firmly in our corner, people who had once tolerated her tyranny, but who now recognized that the real problem wasn't my family at all. It was Karen, and slowly they began to push back, showing up at code inspections to vouch for us, offering to testify that her complaints were baseless, and even forming a small group that began documenting her harassment in order to submit it as evidence of a pattern of abuse, which gave me a sense of solidarity I hadn't felt since moving in, a sense that we were no longer alone in this fight, but rather the reluctant leaders of a quiet rebellion against Karen's reign. Still, despite the growing support, the tension in our daily lives was suffocating, and the stress began to weigh on my wife, who worried constantly about the toll it was taking on our children, and on nights when we tried to relax as a family, we'd often find ourselves startled by sudden knocks at the door, mysterious phone calls that hung up the moment we answered, or even petty vandalism like eggs on the driveway or trash scattered across our lawn. And though there was no direct proof, the timing and nature of it all reeked of Karen's influence. Her fingerprints smudged across every attempt to unsettle us, and while I tried to shield my family from the worst of it, inside me a slow-burning anger was building, the kind that doesn't erupt in a burst, but rather simmers, waiting for the right moment to unleash, and that moment came sooner than expected. One evening after returning from work, I found a letter taped to our door, a crudely written threat that said, "Leave or pay, last warning," with a poorly drawn sketch of a gavel beside it, as if to imply we were about to be crushed in court. And though my wife panicked at the sight, I felt a strange calm because the handwriting was sloppy, rushed, and desperate. And I realized that Karen was no longer orchestrating from a position of power, but lashing out from a place of fear. Her empire reduced to cheap intimidation tactics, and that gave me the clarity I needed to finally take decisive action. The next day, armed with months of footage, copies of her fake letters, and the stack of frivolous complaints she had filed, I walked into the sheriff's office and laid everything out for an investigator who had already been tangentially aware of the HOA raid. And as I spoke, I could see the pieces fitting together in his mind, his expression tightening with every detail, until finally he leaned back and told me that what Karen was doing wasn't just harassment. It was criminal, falling under fraud, identity misrepresentation, and possibly even stalking, depending on how the DA wanted to frame it. And though he couldn't promise immediate arrest, he assured me that my evidence would accelerate the case already building against her, which was exactly what I needed to hear because it meant Karen's downfall was no longer just neighborhood gossip, it was a matter of time. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was evolving, no longer united by fear, but by a kind of shared relief that the nightmare was nearing its end, and it was almost comical to watch Karen still march around as though she were in charge, shouting at kids to wear helmets or scolding adults about lawn heights, even as more and more people openly laughed at her, treating her like the punchline she had become. And yet, as much as I wanted to enjoy the poetic justice, I couldn't ignore the edge of unpredictability about her, because cornered people sometimes lash out in dangerous ways, and sure enough, the climax of her obsession came one fateful Saturday when she called yet another police report on us, claiming that we were operating an illegal business out of our garage, a ludicrous claim that drew two patrol cars, but this time, instead of shrugging it off, the officers recognized her name immediately, shaking their heads and telling us she was already on their radar, even advising us to consider filing a restraining order, and that moment crystallized everything. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was officially a liability in the eyes of law enforcement, and her grip on the community had slipped beyond recovery. By the end of that week, I received a call from the investigator I'd spoken to, who informed me that charges were being formally filed against Karen for fraud and harassment, and that she would likely be facing court soon, which sent a wave of relief through my entire household, but more importantly, it sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Because when word spread that Karen herself was now the subject of criminal charges, the last remnants of her loyal following evaporated, leaving her isolated in her crumbling house, blinds drawn, her once constant presence on the sidewalks now reduced to furtive glances through curtains, and though I should have felt triumphant, what I really felt was exhausted, because surviving her storm of harassment had taken so much from us. Yet, at the same time, I knew this wasn't quite the end because people like Karen never fade away. Quietly, and I could sense deep down that there was still one last eruption left in her before the final silence. The final eruption came like a storm that had been building on the horizon for months, gathering power in the form of Karen's festering resentment and paranoia, and though everyone in the neighborhood thought she had finally been cornered into silence after the fraud charges were announced, the truth was that she was merely retreating to plot something bigger, something dramatic that she believed would restore her throne and erase the humiliation she had suffered. And that twisted belief culminated one humid evening when flashing lights once again illuminated our street. But this time, it wasn't the quiet approach of investigators or the casual arrival of patrol cars. It was a full-blown scene with sirens, multiple squad cars, and uniformed officers moving with the urgency of an active incident. And at first, I thought some terrible crime had happened nearby, but as I stepped outside along with half the neighborhood, it became clear the center of attention was none other than Karen's house, her once pristine fortress now surrounded by law enforcement, her voice shrieking from inside like a banshee as she refused to open the door, insisting that she was being persecuted, that the traitors, meaning my family and the neighbors who turned against her, were conspiring with corrupt authorities to strip her of her rights. And the scene grew even more surreal when an officer on a loudspeaker calmly announced that they had a warrant for her arrest, urging her to come out. Peacefully, while she screamed back about sovereign citizenship and how she did not recognize their authority, a bizarre turn that left neighbors exchanging stunned glances, whispering about how far gone she had become. The standoff stretched into an hour, then two, with Karen occasionally appearing at her window waving papers and shouting about her evidence of conspiracy, until finally officers breached the door, storming in with measured precision, and within minutes they emerged with Karen. In handcuffs, her hair disheveled, her once crisp blouse wrinkled and stained, her face contorted into a mask of rage and disbelief as she shouted about injustice, betrayal, and vengeance. But all the while the neighbors stood silently watching, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads, and for the first time since moving in, I saw not fear in their eyes, but closure, as though the spell Karen had cast over them for years had been shattered once and for all. For me, the moment was strangely bittersweet. On one hand, it was the culmination of months of harassment, the vindication that came from seeing her finally held accountable. But on the other, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity for someone so consumed by their need for control that they had destroyed themselves entirely. And as I watched the police car pull away, Karen still screaming incoherently in the back seat, I knew that chapter of our lives was finally closing, though not without scars. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed in ways I hadn't expected. Without Karen's constant interference, people began relaxing. Kids rode their bikes freely, block parties sprung up without the fear of citations, and the once suffocating atmosphere of scrutiny lifted like a fog, revealing a community that was actually capable of warmth and camaraderie when it wasn't being strangled by one woman's obsession with power, and slowly, my family found our place within it no longer. Outsiders, but part of a collective that had weathered a storm together, and though our exemption from HOA dues remained a technicality, no one brought it up anymore because the entire association itself had collapsed under the weight of Karen's corruption, leaving behind nothing but a cautionary tale about what happens when ordinary people surrender too much control to someone unfit to wield it. Meanwhile, Karen's saga didn't end with that arrest. News articles soon revealed the depth of her fraud, how she had siphoned tens of thousands of dollars into personal accounts, how she had manipulated records to cover her tracks, and how she had harassed multiple families who tried to question her authority, and though she fought tooth and nail in court, representing herself with rambling monologues about conspiracies and enemies, the outcome was inevitable. She was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, harassment, and misrepresentation, sentenced not only to fines and restitution, but also to probation that barred her from holding any leadership role in a community organization again, a poetic justice so precise that even the most cynical neighbors chuckled when they read the news. As for us, the ordeal had left its mark, but it also forged a strength in my family I hadn't anticipated. My wife, once hesitant to confront Karen, became a pillar of resilience, calmly navigating every twist of the drama with a determination that inspired even me, while our kids, though shaken by the experience, learned the value of standing up to bullies, of knowing that truth and patience ultimately outweigh lies and intimidation, and for myself, I came away with a renewed respect for the power of documentation, persistence, and community, because had we tried to fight Karen with anger alone, we might have played into her hands, but by carefully gathering evidence, staying calm, and refusing to break, we allowed her to expose herself for what she truly was. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. People like Karen may roar the loudest, but in the end, their own arrogance is the hammer that smashes their empire. And yet, even as peace returned, there were occasional reminders of what we had endured, stray comments from neighbors about the HOA years, or an old flyer someone found in a drawer, or even the sight of the abandoned clubhouse, now sold to a small business and stripped of its former trappings, a silent monument to a reign of control that collapsed under its own corruption, and every time I passed it, I couldn't help but smile, remembering the day Karen called the cops on us for refusing to join her HOA, never realizing that only hours later it would be her board. Not my family. That would be dragged into the harsh light of justice, a twist of fate so perfect that even now it feels like the universe itself decided to intervene, delivering a reminder that no self-proclaimed tyrant, no matter how petty or powerful they believe themselves, to be is immune from accountability when their empire is built on lies.